Okay? Thank you very much. All right, congratulations, Mark.
I'd like to first thank all of the judges for selecting my work, and also Ron Farrar and his late wife Gayla for choosing to promote and honour such an important field of study. This is an unexpected and profound honour, and I'm truly privileged to have been able to come here and sort of enjoy so many of the fascinating talks so far at this symposium. Having so often been confined to panels where the loose theme of media is so broad as to render any connections really between our papers tenuous at best, it's been great to see the variety of different ways in which colleagues here have explored the connection between media and civil rights history and used this to shed light on often neglected and overlooked subjects. Barbie Zellitzer has claimed that the interdisciplinary nature of the subject has pulled journalism history in different directions, making it a stepchild within a number of largely indifferent family setups. Importantly, she believes historical inquiry offers up the seemingly unlimited terrain of history as a reservoir from which to cull the details that make sense of journalism's unresolved dimensions. From what I've seen so far, I think this symposium is testament to that optimism. I'd also like to thank my supervisor, Simon Hall, and the anonymous reviewers at the Journal of American Studies for helping to smooth off some of my work's rougher edges and help me to explore new and interesting ideas. I'd also like to thank friends and family who've always been there to love and support me, and without whom I'd be much poorer in every possible sense of the word. Finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Campbell, Chris, and Ramon for putting on this conference and for being so gracious and welcoming as I've turned up here in South Carolina. So I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of information about how I became interested in this topic. Not only because it's a story that I've actually had to give quite a few times at family gatherings over the past few years, but also because it ties in quite nicely, I think, with the theme of this year's symposium. So in the second year of my undergraduate degree, I was set an essay that asked, how did the civil rights movement change after 1965? During my reading, it became obvious that for many commentators in the late 1960s, the rhetoric of SNCC chairman Stokely Carmichael symbolized a break with the non-violent and interracial civil rights movement. Having previously described SNCC as one of the most militant and successful frontline groups, editorials in the New York Times typified mainstream press coverage when they condemned Black Power as a hopeless, futile, destructive course expressive merely of a sense of Black impotence. Even sympathetic articles viewed the philosophy as emerging from what they called a wash of frustration that was sweeping over the urban ghetto, rather than the legitimate political grievances, a view reinforced by responsible civil rights leader Roy Wilkins, who claimed that the philosophy could mean only Black death. Taking cues from and often directly citing contemporary commentators, early historians mirrored and legitimized the media's charge that Black Power represented a preemptive and disastrous rejection of central movement tenets, such as integration and non-violence. By the 1980s, this dichotomous view of the decade, known as the declension hypothesis that Peniel Joseph spoke of yesterday, became the widely accepted narrative, with historian Harvard Sitkoff claiming that in 1965, the era of non-violence ended, the age of Malcolm X's angry heirs began. Having looked over this essay recently in a wave of nostalgia, I can remember how, despite a very shallow investigation of the literature, this dichotomous version of the Black freedom struggle struck me as inherently flawed. I returned to this question in my final year when I was lucky enough to be supervised by Professor Tony Badger at Cambridge. And with more time to explore this history, it soon became obvious that my insights in second year were neither original nor uncommon. What I found was a growing literature that deconstructed this declension narrative on almost every front. Firstly, scholars have looked to rehabilitate Black Power activists, stressing the political substance behind their demands, whilst also crediting the movement for important cultural gains. Secondly, historians have utilised grassroots studies to trace the roots of Black Power to the traditions and experiences of working-class African Americans in the rural South as well as the urban North. Finally, works have demonstrated how the equation of Black Power activism with groups such as the Black Panthers ignores the widespread, diverse and long-lasting impact that the rhetoric and philosophy of Black Power had and continues to have on American society. However, what struck me as I prepared for my master's by research was how little of this more nuanced and positive approach to Black Power focused on explaining why such a flawed account of the movement initially emerged. For example, whilst investigating the early adoption of self-defense and other central Black Power tenets by civil rights workers and Southern African American communities, historians have failed to examine the public relations effort that prevented such practices from entering the mainstream narrative. Concentrating instead on the public reception of Black Power, accounts are often too quick to blame, as Peniel Joseph said yesterday, the bully pulpit of the national press, or the violent rhetoric, misogyny and bravado in the speeches and actions of Black Power advocates that made them easy targets for demonization and dismissal. In doing so, they ignore how civil rights activists and organizations, including SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were involved in the propagation of a sanitized movement narrative that contributed to the portrayal of Black Power as a fundamental break with the past. My work, and the article from which this talk is largely taken, therefore attempts to understand how the process of news construction has affected our understanding of social movement activism. Importantly, it looks to humanize this process, challenging conceptions of the mainstream press as a monolithic institution that denied powerless activists any agency in the subsequent coverage it produced. For example, despite often criticizing the media in private, SNCC members were aware of the positive role it could play in their cause and placed a premium on cultivating favorable publicity. Created as a coordinating body in 1960, SNCC's initial public relations efforts were limited to the activities of Jane Stembridge, a white Southerner and SNCC's only full-time staff member. SNCC's participation in the government-sponsored voter education project from 1962, however, prompted the creation of a dedicated communications section, which by 1965 had 5 full-time staffers under the direction of Julian Bond, who you can see in the front here. SNCC also established a photography arm, SNCC Photo, and ran its own printing press to produce publicity materials, including its newsletter, The Student Voice. Consequently, while Bond has later claimed that his work made him feel like a whore or a pimp, distaste for public relations did not prevent the organisation from going, in the words of Dulcie Strawn, further than any other civil rights organisation of the time by creating its own extensive media structure. The dilemma between the benefits of positive media coverage and the ideological and operational sacrifices needed to secure such publicity was not unique to SNCC or the civil rights movement. Indeed, given the role that the media plays in filtering or reframing the messages of social movements, this compromise is common to all organizations that attempt to reach society at large. However, while scholars investigating other radical organizations in the 1960s and 1970s have adopted interdisciplinary approaches that engage with media and social movement theory, civil rights historians have largely resisted such frameworks, even when examining the media strategy of civil rights organizations. Consequently, and despite making heavy use of media sources, civil rights scholars have often failed to engage critically with the process of news construction. Promoting a hegemonic view of media power, supporters of the declension hypothesis, such as former SNCC chairman John Lewis, have claimed that without the media, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. Negative media coverage towards the end of the decade, they argue, was not so much the result of media bias, but later activists, in the words again of Lewis, fumbling the ball of public relations. Accounts by former journalists such as Gene Roberts and Hank Labanoff have continued to exaggerate the importance of race-beat journalists, while downplaying the role that activists and organizations played in disseminating information to the press. Importantly, such arguments have become part of the established movement narrative, with journalism professor Melvin N. Coffey praising the way in which reporters stared down shotgun barrels and crawled out of ditches under gunfire to get stories. Such glorification has led former Farrar Award winner Gordon Mantler to condemn what he refers to as the scholar's virtual lionization of journalists, criticizing accounts for reinforcing the movement's traditional narrative. Recently, Historians such as Vanessa Maffrey and Dulcie Strawn have challenged the notion that civil rights organisations were passive participants in the formation of media discourse and look to counteract what Strawn argues is the little, if any, scholarly attention that is focused on the specific public relations tactics used by those organisations. Whilst their work signifies a considerable advance, neither author fully engages with the relevant scholarship contained within the fields of sociology and communication studies. Indeed, as Mantler argues of the field more widely, none of these studies combine a rigorous analysis of the media's framing in terms of social movement theory with an exploration of civil rights organisations' own efforts to frame their activities to the public. Consequently, while Maffrey's investigation of SNCC's communication section focuses on the communication tools used to advance the movement, it fails to examine the nature of the external pressures which influenced such an effort. Furthermore, by equating success with popularity in the mainstream media, such works often fail to criticise organisations for masking growing disillusionment with central movement tenets. In other words, while these accounts successfully challenge theories of media hegemony in news production, they do not adequately critique the notion that movement strategies were and should be aimed at gaining legitimacy in the eyes of mainstream society. In contrast, the essay I published last year examined how SNCC's communication section often chose to mirror the established movement narrative, rather than highlight important discussion within the movement. More specifically, given that the rejection of non-violence and interracial organising represented two of the most controversial aspects of Black Power, this article challenged the depth of SNCC's commitment to interracial organising, as well as focusing on the way SNCC's communication section purposefully hid the growing acceptance of self-defence amongst field staff. This is not to deny the short-term utility of this approach, or to argue that SNCC was somehow unique in hiding elements of its programme that fell outside of the mainstream narrative. Instead, the article, and hopefully this talk, demonstrated that while movement rhetoric exhorted African Americans to withdraw their support for a system that oppressed them, the very construction and dissemination of that rhetoric was supporting a system that limited debate and restricted action. Before I move on, I'd like to talk a little bit about how this research fits into my wider PhD project, which not only, as Dr. Campbell says, not only examines SNCC and the civil rights movement, but also in particular the Mattachine Society of New York and the homophile movement of the long 1960s. I've chosen to study these two movements because I feel they share a number of important historiographical similarities. So, much like Black Power, the legacy and importance of the Stonewall riots of June 1969, which lasted for more than 2 days and drew crowds of over 2,000 people to the Greenwich Village area of New York, have been hotly contested by historians. Indeed, Terence Kissick goes as far as arguing that almost the entire corpus of gay and lesbian history can be read as an attempt to deconstruct the Stonewall narrative. This narrative, however, which Elizabeth Kennedy summarizes as the belief that before Stonewall, gays lived furtive, closeted, miserable lives, while after Stonewall, gays could be free and open, continues to dominate popular conceptions of movement history, which, as you can see here, officially commemorates the riots as the birth of the modern lesbian and gay rights liberation. Once again, then, we are confronted with a popular narrative that continues to dominate interpretations of a period, despite the best efforts of historians and other academics. However, whilst works such as John D'Amelio's Sexual Politics, Sexual Communities have followed the lead of Black freedom historiography and concentrated on disproving this traditional narrative, historians such as Martin Meeker, Elizabeth Armstrong, and Susanna Krage have attempted to understand its genesis. Whilst first examining this work, I was struck by the similarities between my own master's research and pieces such as Meeker's 2001 article, Behind the Mask of the Mattachine. In both cases, the early media strategies of supposedly respectable groups helped to suppress changes within the movement and concealed more radical programs and ideas that would then often be associated with more vocal activists in later periods. In attempting to explain these similarities, my PhD research has adopted an interdisciplinary approach that uses media and social movement theory to understand how social movements, regardless of their specific focus, often confront very similar issues when attempting to balance the pursuit of mainstream credibility with the needs and desires of their respective communities. In doing so, it shows, I hope, how blending sociological frameworks with historical inquiry can challenge the ahistoricism of the former and false exceptionalism of the latter. Consequently, while much of what I'm about to discuss deals specifically with SNCC in the period 1960 to 65, I believe that many of the central principles regarding this symbiosis between journalists and the activism they cover can lead, and in some cases, as I've said, already has led, to productive questions that cross national, temporal, and subject boundaries. So, SNCC's founding statement of purpose, which reads, "We affirm the philosophical or religious ideal of nonviolence as the foundation of our purpose, the presupposition of our belief, and the manner of our action," would suggest that any espousal of self-defense would be a portrayal of earlier principle. Described by an article in Ebony in May 1964 as every bit as nonviolent as Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, it would also seem that SNCC's early actions reflected a genuine philosophical commitment to nonviolence. However, while the personal commitment of high-profile members such as Julian Bond and John Lewis may be beyond dispute, many members favoured tactical over philosophical interpretations of nonviolence. Importantly, Charles McDew, SNCC chairman from 61 to 63, has argued that this divide was present from SNCC's founding conference in 1960, where the unwillingness of many founding members to subscribe to philosophical nonviolence was one of the reasons that it did not become the youth wing of the SCLC. SNCC's public commitment, then, should not be seen as either unyielding or carrying the private support of all members. Instead, it should be seen as a tactical decision taken in the context of a dominant media discourse that characterized any violence on behalf of African American demonstrators, even in self-defense, as outside the realm of what Bill Chafe calls acceptable dissent. When SNCC members began to live and work in the Deep South, the dominance of tactical interpretations of nonviolence amongst workers became clear. Indeed, whilst the almost universal gun ownership among local African Americans unnerved some staff members, others have fondly recounted the presence of firearms on projects and the role that staff members sometimes played in the defence of those freedom houses. While commonly associated with Black Power, self-defence was a topic of frequent debate within SNCC. An illustrative episode occurred during preparation for the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project, which brought almost 1,000 mostly white volunteers to help local communities overcome segregationist resistance. Discovering that the Greenwood office in Mississippi had armed itself after credible rumors of planned KKK attacks, the organization confronted the issue of self-defense at a staff meeting in early June. During this meeting, a number of members stood up in support of self-defense, pointing to the success of local armed African American community members in ending clan violence. Significantly, arguments in favor of philosophical nonviolence were absent from the minutes. Instead, more pragmatic arguments such as fear of white retaliation or isolating SNCC from the mainstream of the movement dominated discussion. While the organization continued to officially prohibit the members from carrying arms, the issue was clearly a point of contention. Indeed, SNCC volunteer Sam Walker recalls an impromptu discussion at the Oxford orientation sessions just weeks later, in which Stokely Carmichael and others delivered a really stunning, forceful presentation that argued nonviolence had been very effective in some situations, but it was not clear that it had worked or that it would work in the future. Segregationist violence during the summer project would cause such feelings to spread, with white volunteer Elaine DeLotte Baker recalling, "We didn't talk much about the guns. Non-violence was still the credo. In the trenches, however, self-defense was becoming the reality." Despite the clear acceptance of self-defense amongst many on staff, however, SNCC's communication efforts continued to suggest that the organization and its members were philosophically committed to non-violence, even when presented with evidence to the contrary. For example, an article in the Washington Post in June 1964 claimed that in Jackson, Mississippi, Negro guards are posted to guard the offices every night. Thus, in Mississippi today, the two sides already confront each other gun in hand. Aware of the political and financial damage that this article might inflict, Bond penned a swift rebuttal. Let me state that there are no armed guards outside, inside, or around the COFO office in Jackson, or any civil rights office anywhere in the state of Mississippi. Written almost 3 weeks after just such practices were the subject of vigorous internal debate, however, it seems that the communication section was attempting to obscure local deviations from the organization's professed commitment to philosophical nonviolence. While it could be argued that Bond was personally unaware of such discussions, not only has he recalled a big debate in SNCC once about carrying guns, but his colleague Ruby Doris Smith was also cited in the meeting's official minutes, arguing that in 1961 people had arms, but nothing was made of it. Even if Bond was unaware of gun use amongst SNCC staff, he was certainly aware that many members rejected the philosophical nonviolence enshrined in SNCC's statement of purpose. Indeed, in 1963, he personally wrote an article for the journal Freedom Ways, in which he claimed that most of the activists working in the South were tactically as opposed to philosophically committed to nonviolence. When Bayard Rustin accused SNCC staffers of advocating quite openly limited forms of violence in fellowship in July 1964, however, Bond's letter of protest not only dismissed Rustin's accusation, but also claimed that staffers hold true today to our original statement of purpose. With Fellowship's Director of Publications, James S. Best, claiming that other reports have confirmed Rustin's observations, it would seem that SNCC's nonviolent mask was no longer holding up to close scrutiny. The organization, however, still emerged from the 1964 Mississippi Summer Project with its public image on the issue largely intact. Drawing on the work of Jenny Walker, who has claimed that Racebeat reporters intentionally repressed stories of actual and threatened black violence in the South, this discrepancy could be seen as the result of a wider pattern of media sympathy towards the Southern movement. Journalist Fred Powledge, for example, has admitted that when contrasting African Americans with white vigilantes, he and others found it hard to adopt the reporter's fake sense of objectivity, because it was so clear as to who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. Indeed, such favourable bias did not go unnoticed by SNCC's communication section, which compiled a special press list of journalists they considered to be sympathetic to both the movement and the organisation. However, while it's plausible that journalists overlooked minor lapses in nonviolent discipline, sympathetic feelings towards the movement cannot fully explain how SNCC obscured the widespread rejection of philosophical nonviolence amongst its field staff. Instead, as David Ortiz and others have shown, it's important to examine the nature of beat journalists' routines, because this pattern acts to place certain events in their paths, while others escape their attention because they are too far removed from the usual ways of conducting reporters' jobs. Staying in the white community, journalists would observe and report on the heroic displays of tactical nonviolence by demonstrators along Main Street, while missing the widespread use of arms to protect African American homes and civil rights offices that has since been exposed by a number of revisionist historians. Operating in an industry that required certifiable facts or events on which to hang stories, what Herbert J. Gans calls a news peg, the actions of those pictured here would often remain, at best, unsubstantiated rumour. This physical separation, then, meant that white reporters were viewing the Southern movement through a particular and well-choreographed window. With local wire press reporters often refusing to print movement stories, and the New York Times assigning only one permanent reporter to all 11 of the southern states before '64. SNCC found that overt civil rights abuses often failed to draw much needed media attention. Consequently, SNCC's early communication section efforts basically had to serve as an alternative wire press in the South, with Julian Bond instructing his colleagues in SNCC's Washington office to act as a source for information for journalists on stories that they're too lazy to look up themselves. In taking on this role, SNCC highlighted the pervasiveness of passive reporting, which gave the organisation much greater control over the image that was projected through the mainstream media. On the rare occasions when journalists did attempt to investigate SNCC's position in more detail, the organisation was careful to control the subsequent image that was received. During the Mississippi Summer Project, for example, the communications section instructed all volunteers to refer journalistic inquiries to project directors, presumably to make sure that the organization could better control what information actually made it to the press, and perhaps more importantly, what did not. The success of this strategy is clear from a working paper written for communication staff by Mary King in 1964, who claimed, "It was almost embarrassing this past summer to pick up newspapers from across the country and read line for line the news reports that were written in the Jackson Communications Office." Indeed, having interviewed 51 SNCC veterans in 1968, Emily Stoper has argued that on the issue of nonviolence, the ideal appears to have declined in SNCC long before its statements to the press, or the press's treatment of those statements, began to reflect that decline. As Newsweek's Peter Goldman has argued, the media were part of the strategy. It was sort of one hand washes the other. We had an interest in getting the story, obviously, and they had an interest in getting the story framed as a struggle between peaceful petitioners and a recalcitrant and often violent Southern resistance. However, while some events, such as the recently commemorated brutality of Bloody Sunday in Selma in March 1965, neatly fit this good versus evil narrative that activists and journalists in the South had constructed, this frame had important ramifications on other aspects of the movement. As King found in Albany, to make this narrative work, the movement required a villain. Not just a villain, but a villain who was unrestrained and unthinking in their denial of equality. As Goldman has argued, when it came to media coverage, the morality play doesn't really work if Satan isn't in it. While my article focused on the so-called heroic period, as Peniel Joseph terms it, of civil rights activism between 60 and 65, it's important to stress the impact that this framing would have on later activism. For example, this idea of a Satan who was responsible for the plight of non-violent angels helped create an impossible standard against which future protests would be measured. Consequently, while self-defense has been a key feature of SNCC, CORE and NAACP projects across the South for years, the open inclusion of the Deacons for Defense in the Meredith March of 1966 was viewed as a fundamental break in the movement. Furthermore, this morality play reduced Jim Crow racism to individual prejudice. Profiles of Sheriff Clark that dubbed him Selma's symbol of racism were indicative of news coverage that painted the South and its people as a distant aberration. For example, profiling SNCC in January 1965 as preparations built up in Selma, Ralph Gleason, the founder of Rolling Stone magazine and syndicated music columnist, called the South an America unknown to the rest of us. As a result, when Black Power activists began to openly and forcefully critique the system and institutionalized racism of the urban North as well as the rural South, and did so in a way that challenged the passive role that African Americans had been seen to occupy in the morality plays of Birmingham and Selma, they were greeted with surprise and alarm. While not wanting to deny Jean Theo Harris's characterization of this mood as the surprise of intransigence, a willful shock, it is important to note how encouraging a good versus evil narrative in the South fed into white northern conceptions of the freedom struggle that emphasized the role of whites, downplayed African American agency, sanctified nonviolent direct action, and focused attention on a small number of people, organizations, and individuals. Indeed, white involvement in SNCC, at least en masse, was inextricably tied to its capacity to increase media coverage and temporarily reduce segregationist brutality. Again, if we look at SNCC's statement of purpose, it claims that the integration of human endeavor was the crucial first step on the road to a social order of justice permeated by love. The reality of SNCC's beloved society was never as clear-cut. While associated with Black Power, the expulsion of whites from SNCC had its foundations in long-standing tensions between interracial commitments and the psychological and practical needs of African American members and community organizers. Indeed, Stokely Carmichael has argued that the idea of Black Power ruining some form of interracial Eden within SNCC is typical of the reductive, simplistic, media-driven version of history. This is not to argue that SNCC's commitment to an interracial, beloved community was a falsehood perpetrated for the sake of positive publicity, but rather that the organization's media strategies during the summers of 63 and 64 have created a misleading impression of the scale and nature of this commitment. Before 1963, only a handful of whites were on SNCC's payroll, with those such as Jane Stembridge, William Hanson, and Robert Zellner agreeing that whites in the freedom struggle should be and would be, as far as leadership is concerned, in a secondary role. Largely Southerners, early white activists often had as much invested in the movement as the African Americans with whom they worked. Zellner, for example, recalled in his autobiography that, "I didn't come south to help black people. I was already here, and I got involved to free myself." The nature of SNCC's early commitment to interracial struggle, therefore, was the result of a careful balance between the inclusion of whites and the preservation of African American independence. Indeed, while the expertise and commitment of early white volunteers was welcomed, it was agreed that their role would be limited to administrative duties or work on white campuses. Even when continued staff shortages meant that whites became more directly involved with Southern projects in 1962, their presence was primarily seen as an important psychological tool that allowed rural African Americans, many of whom had never interacted with whites on an equal basis, to safely dispel Jim Crow myths about racial differences. And there's quite a cute story in Zellner's autobiography where he talks about how all the children in the communities he'd visit would ruffle his hair, because they'd been told that white people's hair was like chicken feathers. So the nature of SNCC's early commitment to interracial struggle, therefore, was the result of a careful balance between the inclusion of whites and the preservation of African American independence. Indeed, while the expertise and commitment of early white volunteers was welcomed, it was agreed that their role, however, while initial efforts at interracial organizing in the South had provoked heavy segregationist violence, especially when it involved white women, organizers found that large number of white volunteers in the Mississippi Freedom Vote of 1963 actually had the opposite effect. Indeed, Bob Moses has recalled, that was the first time that I realized that the violence could actually be controlled, turned, on and off, that it wasn't totally random. I realized that somewhere along the line, there was somebody who, even if they didn't actually order it to happen, could at least send out word for it to stop. Rather than representing the success of interracial brotherhood or philosophical nonviolence, this reduction in brutality was the consequence of increased media coverage, with SNCC finding that wherever its white sons and daughters, interest would follow. Wherever its white sons and daughters went, intense interest would follow. Despite greater inclusion, many in the organization still felt that college-educated middle-class whites were unsuitable organizers of rural working-class African Americans. Writing in a field report in November 1963 about a white volunteer under his command, Charles Cobb argued that, "I know that we're all brothers and that whites have a role in this movement, but I can't really escape thinking that Negroes are reacting to his whiteness or completely accept the idea of a white directing Negroes to freedom." Indeed, while superficially successful, the use of whites in organizing African Americans in the South was fraught with potential dangers. Attributing previous success to the fact that black people are doing it themselves in their own way and articulating their own demands, SNCC staffers such as Cobb feared that the educated and trained white volunteers from Northern college campuses would undermine the fledgling leadership that SNCC was encouraging in the rural South. With Ivanhoe Donaldson, another SNCC member, claiming that mass white involvement risked losing the one thing where the Negro can stand first, the majority of African American members at a November 1963 meeting in Greenville voted to reject the use of whites in the upcoming summer project. According to James Foreman, this opposition was eventually overturned by a rare display of personal leadership from the organizer of the project, Bob Moses, who declared, "I will not be part of a racist organization." Moses has since claimed, however, that it was a desire to force federal involvement rather than a commitment to interracial organizing that actually motivated his stance. Indeed, he argues that the murder of Louis Allen in Liberty, Mississippi in January 1964 convinced him that we need to do something big that would really open the situation up. Otherwise, they'd simply continue to kill the best amongst us. Produced for a white audience, the mainstream media focused on events in the South that involved white volunteers, especially white Northerners, and would often go to lengths to mention white participants. while the unusual nature of interracial organising was definitely a factor in the disproportionate attention given to the presence of white volunteers, it's clear that dominant racial attitudes also played an important part in coverage. For example, during its coverage of Bloody Sunday, the photo magazine Life disproportionately featured white activists in its coverage. Nor was Life alone, with stories such as this 1963 New York Times piece about the arrest of 10 activists in Virginia, actually naming the white participants before reporting that these 7 others were Negroes. Indeed, while the assassination of high-profile leaders such as Medgar Evers received considerable coverage, it was not until James Chaney was murdered alongside activists Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner that the death of an African-American civil rights worker became major national news. Such instances made it clear to observers like journalist Calvin Trillin of The New Yorker that no sophisticated study of public opinion is needed to establish the fact that in the United States, North or South, a white life is considered to be of more value than a Negro life. In order to protect workers during the summer project then, Doug McAdam has argued that SNCC found themselves in the distasteful position of having to exploit the very racism that they had been victims of. However distasteful, SNCC's communication section actively used the presence of white volunteers to boost its media exposure and secure, in their words, the limited protection that publicity affords. Repeatedly requesting that workers submit and update biographical profiles, SNCC's communication section matched Northern volunteers to their local and state newspapers, TV stations and radio stations, and would send detailed reports when any volunteer was arrested, beaten, or otherwise involved in what they termed newsworthy activities. Predictably, this situation generated resentment amongst the African Americans on staff who, McAdam argues, felt that it wasn't black Mississippians or even the abstract concept of civil rights that concerned white America, but simply the safety of its sons and daughters. While early white activists had often filled technical positions such as typists, radio broadcasters, and print setters, the recruitment of more Southern African American students into the movement following the summer project meant that SNCC no longer relied on the technical expertise of white volunteers and could be more selective in their hiring policies. Furthermore, by 1965, the growth in local leadership of people like Fannie Lou Hamer that Dr. Joseph spoke of yesterday and the day before meant that many of those who had benefited from interactions with whites in the early stages of the movement had, according to SNCC staffer Dorothy Dewberry, grown beyond that experience. However, while reservations about the use of whites were now widespread, Charles Cobb has argued that when it came to openly expressing such fears, SNCC members were victims of our own rhetoric, because at the same time we were arguing desegregation, integration, so you couldn't argue that you're opposed to white people coming down. Even internally, this issue was one with which many SNCC staffers struggled. Talking at a staff meeting on the eve of the summer project, for example, Donna Moses argued that during previous discussions, we didn't really grapple with the problems because people were ashamed of admitting their feelings. These tensions were not unique to SNCC. Indeed, when SNCC voted to bar whites from organizing in the African American community in May 1966, an aide to Dr. King told the New York Times that we can understand why SNCC no longer will let whites organize in rural areas, adding that while SCLC would not make such a blanket rule, they were becoming more selective about the whites we use. While SNCC's move would be dismissed as racist by the mainstream press, it echoed the concerns of commentators in the African American community, such as journalist Louis Lomax, who argued in August 1965 that white liberal money and bodies have moved in and taken over every national civil rights organization with the exceptions of CORE and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. From the outset, SNCC's approach to white participation depended on a complex and highly variable process that prioritized the needs, both psychological and physical, of the local African American community. Indeed, white volunteer Larry Rubin, who worked for SNCC as a voter registration worker in Georgia from 1962 on and off until 65, argues that whilst there were always whites in SNCC, their role was always a question, and it was answered differently in different places. SNCC's communication output, however, whilst legitimately aimed at raising awareness, contributed to the notion that white Northern volunteers were taking the lead in the Southern movement. For SNCC, media exposure was initially seen to carry three important benefits. It supported fieldwork in the South by reducing segregationist violence. It encouraged the flow of resources and donations to the organization's Southern projects, and it won allies to the cause by exposing the barbarism of Jim Crow. Purposefully avoiding the term public relations, however, SNCC's approach to media strategy differed from that of other civil rights organizations. Complaining to the New York Post in May 1962 that it is distressing commentary when to exist one must have an image, and to have an image one must often compete with others whose image is built on publicity alone. Bond and others within the organization saw publicity as reinforcing rather than replacing active fieldwork. It is not surprising, therefore, that SNCC's approach to the benefits of media coverage changed when those benefits were no longer seen to outweigh the logistical, operational and strategic costs of securing publicity. For example, while the federal government's reluctance to protect civil rights workers in 1962 had led SNCC to maximize coverage, faith in the media's ability to protect workers was fading by 1965, as it became clear that while civil rights workers now could assume there would be a more thorough investigation if they were murdered, they were still on their own in the matter of staying alive. Working largely in rural areas that the mainstream media was either unwilling or unable to cover, SNCC staffers increasingly found that arms, whether carried by community members or activists themselves, often provided the only tangible and reliable protection against organized segregationist violence. Afraid of alienating supporters, however, SNCC initially denied this widespread deviation from their founding principles and encouraged the romantic belief that workers in the South were confronting segregationist violence with only love and forgiveness, rather than organized armed resistance. Similarly, while the limited early involvement of whites in SNCC was embraced as part of the organization's beloved community, their mass involvement in the summer projects of 1963 and 64 helped create a misleading image of interracial organizing within the organization. With mass white participation predicated on the publicity it brought rather than any ideological commitment, it was inevitable that interracial cooperation within the organization would decline when the organization began to question the benefits of mainstream coverage. When SNCC eventually attempted to limit white participation to activities in the white community, this idealized image of interracial cooperation helped the organization's opponents accuse it of racist black nationalism, and obscured the fact that this was actually a return to previous practice that was also being adopted by other civil rights organizations across the South. Without the NAACP's membership dues or SCLC's ties to the African American church, SNCC was unusually dependent on donations from liberal allies. While critics of Black Power have argued that its rhetorical excesses alienated liberal support, Herbert Haynes has shown that average monthly donations in the 7 months prior to the slogan's launch were almost 50% down on the previous year. Indeed, 1966 saw overall contributions to the movement fall for the first time in over 10 years, and SCLC's funding fall by a larger percentage than SNCC's. Mirroring lessons that SNCC had found in its Southern projects, this decline in the media's ability to raise funds for the organization encouraged the idea that economic self-sufficiency within the black community was a necessary first step to the establishment of a successful political movement. In turn, this movement towards the black community meant that SNCC's communication efforts would begin to be aimed at a fundamentally different audience and would therefore take on a fundamentally different tone. Consequently, SNCC's espousal of Black Power was intrinsically linked to shifting attitudes towards the mainstream media and its role as a gateway to mainstream white America. So to finish, Peniel Joseph, who gave such a wonderful keynote speech yesterday, or a couple of wonderful keynote speeches yesterday, has argued that the declension narrative means that Black Power can be conveniently blamed for the demise of the civil rights movement, rather than being viewed as an alternative to the ineffectiveness of civil rights demands in critical areas of American life. While I think most of us here would certainly echo that statement, what this interpretation omits is how the early rhetoric and public actions of civil rights organisations helped to hide such ineffectiveness. Adopting and reinforcing certain strands of movement discourse also enabled the legitimate and popular criticisms contained within Black Power to be associated with urban unrest and violent rhetoric, rather than the grassroots communities of the rural South where many of these ideas were formed. While one can understand why SNCC felt it necessary to craft its public face to match the demands and needs of a white mainstream media, it's nevertheless important to understand how the early rhetoric of civil rights organisations strengthened and legitimised the now debunked declension narrative. Thank you.